All right. Looks like we made it to season 2, fellas.
More importantly, we made it to 2021.
Yeah, barely.
Yeah, well, you had a very eventful late 2020.
Oh yeah. So for the audience out there, in early December, I actually tested positive for COVID and spent basically almost all of the month of December in quarantine. And yeah, that sucked. I actually, in all honesty, there was parts of me that was worried I wasn't gonna make it to 2021 at certain
Wait, but
points.
Nick,
Oh,
I thought
jeez.
COVID was just a hoax.
Yeah, yeah. Apparently, a hoax can kill you, though. No.
It's a powerful word, man. It's like I tested positive for the hoax, and then the hoax goes, you know.
There were
Man.
so many problems, but I think the one that sucked the most, once as my symptoms started to subside, like the more serious one that sucked the most was losing my taste and smell. That fucks you up,
It's like you're tasting cardboard and smelling nothing.
basically.
Like imagine, like the thing is, though, I could find a positive in lack of smell because like you can just rip a fart, loud, and just everyone's like, oh, what the hell? I'd be like, I ain't smelling nothing. Because
Everything's great here.
because here's the thing though, you're immune from the he who smelt it dealt it, accusation. But I
That's
can't
true.
smell it. That's true. That
You're
is a
immune
truism.
from having dealt it then.
So Nick couldn't have smelt it, nor could he have dealt it.
Yeah, although
Oh,
it did make bathroom trips nice. If if you're anything like me who likes to get like most of his reading done in the bathroom, you can't do that for too long because if you're taking a shit, oh god, it starts to smell bad. But when you can't smell anything, it's like, oh yeah, uh huh, uh huh, uh huh.
Nick's just like in the bathroom reading entire Dostoevsky novels since he doesn't have to worry about the smell.
imagine him recording this episode in the bathroom.
I mean, for all we know, he is.
I mean, I could see the back room against the back wall of his room. So I mean, I'm greatly
It could be one of
disappointed
those
that
like staged background things though that Zoom lets you do. We don't know that that is his actual location right now.
true, true. I can see your pixels dissipate like when you turn left and right.
So I'm actually, as of recording of this episode, returning to work for the first time in almost a month tomorrow.
How
How
you
you
feeling
feeling
about
about
it?
that?
I'm unsure because I work 10 hours a day. I have no stamina. Like, I'll take Morgana, my dog, for the audience out there, for a walk, and I can't breathe like I used to, and I definitely can't. Definitely get tired very quickly.
Yeah, that's like I guess like I was watching a video about the whole thing of like long haulers
Yeah.
and people having like problems beyond recovery. And so let's hope that it gets better sooner.
Yeah, my dad actually he got it like 3 or 4 months back or so, and he actually is still dealing with the fatigue as of now. But I mean, he's obviously older and also doesn't have great health. But yeah, it's definitely not a joke.
So I can't stress this enough. I don't know how much longer this is gonna go. It sucked. I wanted to fucking kill myself because I felt so shitty. And that's not a joke. I'm not joking. I felt that bad. Wear your mask. Keep your distance. Do all that stuff. We can get past this, but you need to, and the government needs to pay us. I'm sorry. You
Yeah,
can't. You can't force like. There's no reason. Why do we have to keep sacrificing ourselves at the altar of capitalism?
yeah, and every
Because
other
if
industrialized country is paying its citizens in some form or another. Like most of them, like monthly on a monthly basis.
if you want us to stay home, pay us to stay home.
Yeah, so we don't fucking go homeless.
Yeah.
All right. Well, we're going to get this episode started, but before we do, we have an announcement. And that announcement is that we will be launching Patreon.
A Patreon.
Yes, a Patreon.
Tell us more, Nick.
There'll be 3 tiers at $1, $5, and $8. Follow us on our social media accounts will have more information about what those tiers entail. But needless to say, just to give you a quick sample, for everybody who signs up will get to listen to the episode a day in advance. There'll be some cool tidbits, a little bit of individual stuff that each of us liked working on, a chance to play with us in like Among Us or any other game we can think of, a monthly Q&A, stuff like that that's coming. And hell, you might even get a chance to pick a movie for us.
That's
Let's
right.
just hope
yeah.
let's just hope that it's not. Well, actually, let's hope the audience picks Thor Ragnarok.
Yes, absolutely. The most important.
You have to follow the rules. You have to follow the rules and pick a historically based movie. Thor Ragnarok.
So, just so everyone knows, Nick actually lacked taste long before he got COVID because he hates Thor Ragnarok.
That being said, Captain America: The First Avenger is technically valid because it does use a historical setting in its movie.
Huh. Good point.
Yeah, but it's like a subplot though. So we'll be talking about like 20 minutes of Captain America. 20 minutes of no, I mean, yeah, historical movies. You know, we can read the Bhagavad Gita to see if Thor existed. No, I'm just kidding. No, I'm just kidding. Just kidding. That'd be historically inaccurate. We had a mouthful of history. Don't want to throw no historical inaccuracies at people.
All right. If we're lucky, and we finally put our shit together and put our money together, there will be a theme song right now.
Fuck Andrew Jackson.
Fuck Andrew Jackson.
Fuck Andrew Jackson.
Or we're just gonna die like patriots.
There's no bigger middle finger than, hey, you want to put me in suicide missions? Okay, I'm just going to keep living.
He clearly figured out how to go Super Saiyan.
He wanted Schmeling dead, but he just wouldn't die.
He was anti-bank, anti-paper money, and he's on the $20 bill.
Nico just comes out of nowhere, soars across the sky.
Welcome back to A Mouthful of History, Season 2!
What up?
Season 2, what was good? Freaking what up, dude?
I'm your host, Nick. Joined with me via Zoom chat, David.
Hey everyone, what's poppin'? Happy 2021.
And Cameron.
Friggin' what up, dude? Season 2. We're out here gonna have even better topics. We're second time around. Let's see if it's better than the first.
Well, sequels have a mixed history.
I can only hope that season 2 of A Mouthful of History will be the Dark Knight or Spider-Man 2 of our podcast.
Let's just put it this way: we have not given up by now, so we have to pat ourselves in the back.
So while we were sitting around trying to map out what to do, what to give you guys for a second season, our producer / editor / ruler of the podcast, Caroline, suggested that we take it back and do another election episode. And they're fun, they're quick, and it allows us to get some more material to you as fast as possible. So we thought, why the hell not? Before we get into the deep and heavy stuff.
It's a nice little palate cleanser.
Exactly.
We bringing it back. Rewind.
So, welcome to Electile Dysfunction 2, Elect Harder.
Love it.
So once again, like we did last time, we're just going to pick an election. We're going to talk about it, some background, some historical context, and what it all meant. And I couldn't think of a better way to start than basically what amounts to the sequel election to the election I picked to start off our whole journey, and that is the election of 1828, which in many ways is, at least the way I see it, a sequel to the election of 1800. It was another election that kind of set the stage for the politics of the next few years. It involves an Adams.
Our boys, the Adams.
It involves a JQA.
And it's fascinating. And I can't wait to tell you more about it. But before I do, we need some background. So, as you all remember, in the election of 1800, Jefferson defeated John Adams and ushered in the Jeffersonian era, the era defined by him and his politics. Adams' loss also represents the last major election won Federalist figure on the grand stage. Jefferson would win re-election in 1804. His handpicked successor, James Madison, would win back-to-back, 1808 and 1812. And then his handpicked successor, James Monroe, would win back-to-back. This would usher in the era of good feeling. Actually, at the point of James Monroe's re-election, there was so little opposition to the Democratic Republicans, henceforth known as the Democrats for the sake of not having to repeat that word 1,000 times, that James Monroe ran unopposed for re-election.
Election?
Let's see, 1820 election. He ran unopposed.
That's crazy. That has to be one of the only times that's ever happened, right?
Yes. In fact, he fell one electoral vote short of a unanimous. And history is kind of funny, the way people look at things. Because for the longest time it was, it's because we only wanted George Washington to be the only unanimously selected president of all time. Not true. Not true at all. The elector was a faithless elector who just thought James Monroe was a bad president.
Wow. And that was it. And
That was
everyone else voted for him.
Yeah.
It's like it's a going unanimous for Mariano Rivera in the Hall of Fame voting.
Here, I got it right here. Who that vote went to. Because you can't just vote faithless. You have to actually pick somebody.
George Washington's wooden teeth?
Actually, it went to John Quincy Adams, which is a great segue into the last little bit of information you need before we get to 1828. So we had the election of 1824. Now, like I said, there's only one party, but there are, of course, factions of the Democratic Party. And each of these factions are kind of vying for they're very sectionalized. So, for instance, John Quincy Adams, who is at this point Secretary of State, actual author of the Monroe Doctrine, he's the one who actually wrote it, but of course, because James Monroe was the president at the time, he gets credit. He obviously has a foothold in the Northeast. Henry Clay and Andrew Jackson are focused in the West, and then Crawford is a Southerner, William Crawford.
And do they have distinct kind of ideological differences, or is it mostly regional?
They have regional issues. John Quincy Adams is also a lot more foreign policy focused. As he's from the Northeast, tariffs would be a bigger issue for him. But that's really secondary because this is it becomes an election of personalities. And there's no bigger personality in the 1824 election than Andrew Jackson.
Shit, it's hard to say that there's a bigger personality in like the early 1800s at all than Andrew Jackson.
Andrew Jackson famously was the hero of New Orleans, which only happens because news travels so slowly about the end of the fucking War of 1812 that they're still fighting when that happens.
Holy shit.
Yeah, that fight happened technically after the Treaty of Ghent had been signed.
Ooh, that is awkward.
He's a charismatic figure. He has a man of the people persona, which is hilarious, knowing that he's a wealthy planter who owns a plantation.
Just wear tattered clothes and be like, I'm for the people. And like the back pocket, you have like a stack of hundreds.
As you'd expect, because of the sectionalization of the electorate, nobody can really get a foothold in the election. And actually, nobody wins a clear majority of the votes in 1824. Jackson does win the most popular. By the way, 1824 is the first election where the popular vote is tallied. Jackson wins a plurality of both the popular vote and the electoral college, but he doesn't win a majority. Now, pop quiz, if a person doesn't win the majority of the electoral votes, what happens?
Oh, Jesus.
I honestly don't remember.
It has to involve Congress, right? Congress has to do something about it?
Yes, the House of Representatives does vote on it.
Yeah, that's what I was going to say, but I'm like, I was thinking of like when the vice president dies. Like the president dies, vice president dies, the Speaker of the House becomes president.
So the top three vote getters get to go on to the next round. Henry Clay lost. He had finished with the fourth most. so he doesn't get in. However, Henry Clay is in an advantageous position because he is, while running for president, the Speaker of the House.
So I mean, he kind of writes himself in, like, well, I'm the Speaker of the House, so yeah, I can mess this up, which I don't think he does.
Henry Clay holds a grudge against Andrew Jackson because they were competing for the same voters.
I mean, shit, I'd hold a grudge to Andrew Jackson. That guy's a racist.
Yeah,
so is
but I
Henry
think
Clay.
your grudge would be based on principle and not just personality.
Yeah, on the issues, not personalities.
So Henry Clay kind of uses his authority, his power, his persuasion to tell everyone to vote for John Quincy Adams over Andrew Jackson, which they do. And then John Quincy Adams makes Henry Clay his Secretary of State. So this creates a situation where the Jacksonians believe there was a corrupt bargain behind the scenes to make sure that the man of the people did not get the presidency. All right, we got all that?
So one guy got sore not being in the top 3. He tells everyone else to vote for John Quincy Adams, and that's all she wrote.
Yeah. Now, in a just world, that would be the end of the conversation. However, in the midterms, the Jacksonian wing of the Democratic Party actually cleans up pretty well, and this kind of just sets the stage for the 1828 presidential election, which instead of a big kind of fucking free-for-all with 4 people, we have 2. John Quincy Adams versus Andrew Jackson. Now, I could tell you all about what are the problems of the time and all of this, but that really was secondary to what was most important about this election. And what was most important about this election was mudslinging. Lots and lots of mudslinging.
Oh, yeah.
Oh yeah, I like some mud. Give me some of that mud.
You know, it is funny how, like, every election, there's always people lamenting the fact that, oh, this is such an ugly election. Why can't we go back to the way elections used to be? But for most of U.S. history, elections have never actually really been that nice.
No, not at all.
The 2 biggest talking points out of this election were Jackson camp alleged that the Adams presidency was presenting young American girls to the Tsar of Russia, young virgin American girls.
So in other words, painting their political opponents as pedophiles, a thing that doesn't happen anymore.
Not just that, but painting them as, like, basically making the president come off as like a pimp.
So kind of like some old school QAnon.
Basically. There's no evidence for this, by the way.
Oh, of course.
Yeah, so it's very much like QAnon adjacent.
Yeah. If you remember in the 1800 election, a lot of the mudslinging that was labeled towards John Adams by the Jefferson camp wasn't really founded in truth. Same thing here with the Jacksonian. The Adams countered that Andrew Jackson was married in sin. By that, I mean that he married his wife before she had gotten a divorce.
Ooh.
Yeah.
Now, there is truth to that. However, in the interest of fairness, his wife did not know that their divorce with her previous husband had been finalized.
So it wasn't
Oof.
intentional.
It wasn't intentional. Yeah. And they did hold a second ceremony legally binding them once that was finalized. But that was what they ran with. Basically, like, how can you let this man, this unmoral man, be the fucking president of the United States? Not to mention, you know, there was stuff like, there was really attacks on Jackson for being a slave trader. Not for owning slaves, mind you, to being a slave trader.
So owning slaves, totally fine. But being a slave trader, that's where you cross the line.
Basically.
It's not like, you know, they don't need the slave trade anymore. It's to still be morally corrupt. Either way, it's wrong.
And really, that's all this election came down to was a bunch of bullshit fighting amongst themselves over who was the more moral person. So Jackson thoroughly kicks Adams' ass in this election. You know, in terms of popular vote, there's about a 13-point difference in votes. And he more than doubles Adams' electoral vote. It was a slaughter.
Which is a shame, considering that John Quincy Adams was like an abolitionist. He was definitely less shitty towards Native Americans than Jackson was. Just generally a better dude.
So, in the aftermath, Rachel Jackson, Andrew Jackson's wife, She had been suffering from chest pains, but everybody believes that the election kind of took its toll on her, and she died before Jackson could even be sworn in. Jackson always blamed his opponents for killing his wife.
Even though politics is a super stressful game,
Yeah.
and it can get the best of anybody.
And he's quoted as saying, "I forgive my enemies, but for the people who did this to my wife, they'll have to answer to God."
Jeez, man.
So Jackson becomes president, ushers in the age of Jackson, or the Jacksonian era, which would define politics up till about the Civil War. And don't feel bad for John Quincy Adams. John Quincy Adams would go take a break, then he'd be back in Congress as a member of the House of Representatives, where he would become a staunch Jackson opponent and one of the most prominent abolitionist figures in the House.
I actually got a book recently about John Quincy Adams' post-presidency, and I'm really excited to read it.
And Jackson's presidency is kind of thought of as the beginning of common man's era, because now it wasn't just landowners who could vote, it was any white man. And that's
It
really
helped expand democracy, but still didn't totalize it.
And that's kind of the election of 1828. It's kind of short, but the major points you have to remember is basically this cements Andrew Jackson as a major force, puts him at the head, and Jackson would become one of the 5 most important men to ever, he's a jackass, but one of the 5 most important men to ever hold the office, because no one before him expanded the power of the presidency like he did.
He helped get the ball rolling on the imperial presidency.
Basically. So this is kind of the start of that. Everything you can think of that a president has done to expand its power, from Lincoln suspending habeas corpus to the Patriot Act.
Wow, thanks, Jackson.
Yeah, that's Jackson.
Thanks a lot.
And that's the election of 1828.
So with the election of 1912, we should probably talk about how we get to 1912. In the late 1800s, kind of after the end of the Civil War, and even after the end of Reconstruction, industrialization in the country is really starting to take off. And actually, kind of in a lot of ways, it is industrialization that kind of shifts the focus of the Republican Party from the question of what to do with the South toward dealing with industrialization in the North, what to do with industry, what to do with workers, and all that. And so during this time, you see the rise of really industrial cities, kind of like the prototype of what we would call like a modern city now. And these cities change a lot of the sort of, political and just general makeup of how society is structured. Because a large group that emerges during the rise of the city is the new middle class. And so the new middle class is composed of like white collar professionals, teachers, people who work in clerical jobs, even people like social workers and stuff like that. Just all these different, white collar jobs that aren't the rich. They're not the owners of giant factories, but they're also not the poor. And also within that group too are specialized blue collar workers. So they're not the person working on the floor of the factory necessarily, but they are getting their hands dirty, but their skills are a little more socialized. And so they kind of have the status and income level, more of a sort of middle of the road white collar professional, as opposed to the working poor, basically the working class. And these people are the ones who actually form the base of the progressive movement, which aim to remake the world in a more kind of modern, humane way. And that's where the term progressive comes from. Like, you literally see yourselves as ushering in progress. At the same time, the rise of industrialization is also, of course, creating the working class. And so you have, people that are working in factories, working in mines, docks, and all these other sort of blue collar jobs that usually pay poverty. And so these groups, the working class, or rather the working class, organized and tended to be more radical. Usually there were socialists, anarchists, even communists, especially those who were immigrants. So I just have to say real quick as a side note, you hear all these Republicans who, and even like center-leaning Democrats who are like, oh, when my great-grandfather came to this country from Italy in the beginning of the 1900s, he didn't ask for excuses. But I mean, honestly, your great-grandfather was probably a socialist or an anarchist, maybe even a communist. So put that in your pipe and smoke it, as they say.
How do you think that shit got here to the United States? Immigrants.
Yeah, exactly. We have this idea that it came through academia, which wasn't really true up until about the like middle of the 20th century of the 1900s. There was, of course, left-wing academics, but it was a movement more prominent among the actual working class. But anyway, that brings us to the era leading up to 1912. And, since the 1912 election had a lot of people who were in politics before, we'll kind of get through them real quick. So, Theodore Roosevelt and Howard Taft. Teddy Roosevelt became president in September of 1901 after President William McKinley, who he was the vice president for, got murked by an anarchist steelworker named Leon Solgaz. I'm sure I'm butchering the shit out of that name, but he got murked by an anarchist steelworker.
What's the etymology of the name?
He was a second generation Polish American.
Okay. I can understand why you butchered that last name.
Yeah,
it sounds
the
like
spelling is Czolgozz, and I'm just not sure what to do with myself.
Chorgatsky is what? Chorgaji, like.
Shogak, maybe? I don't know. I don't want to.
It sounds like when you say Polish last name, it sounds like you're on ice skates.
Yeah. Apologies out there. I am just going to call this person Leon. But anyway, Roosevelt, after becoming the president, actually helped realign the Republican Party because pretty much from the end of Reconstruction to, that period in 1900, the Republican Party had been dominated by industrial interests who were basically just focused on expansion of industry and capital. And so Roosevelt realigned it so that the Republican Party also had a really strong progressive faction. And as president, he did a lot of things, but most famous, of course, he was a trust buster, where he enforced the Sherman antitrust law like no president before him ever really had. He also created the FDA, created the National Conservation Commission for the Environment. He forbade corporations from contributing to political campaigns, enacted consumer protection standards, and even helped facilitate peace in the war between Japan and Russia, for which he won a Nobel Prize. But he did also have an imperialist streak, and that was shown not just by his enthusiastic participation in the Spanish-American War, but also just a lot of tomfoolery in Central America and the Caribbean that we don't have time to get into right now. Also,
because of the Monroe Doctrine.
Yeah, so he actually modified the Monroe Doctrine, but really he kind of changed it completely. So originally, Nick kind of touched on this before, but originally the Monroe Doctrine was Europe, stay out of the Americas. We as the United States are going to have the backs of other places here if you try to mess with them. What Teddy Roosevelt changed it to was, instead of trying to have the backs of other countries in the Americas, it was, this is our backyard. We have the right to do what we want in the interest of our security. So went from trying to theoretically help people in the Americas to kind of claiming an implicit ownership over them, or at least a right to do what you want over there. And in addition to that, even though he was progressive for his time on issues of like civil rights for Black folks, he was super shitty to Native Americans. He was a really enthusiastic proponent of displacing them and destroying their culture. So basically, Teddy Roosevelt was pretty cool for people inside the United States, not very cool for people that were outside the U.S.
Nope.
But of course, since he was a good president for people in the U.S., he was incredibly popular. So easily won re-election in 1904, and for 1908, because he had pledged not to run for two elections and serve as the president for 3 terms, his successor, Howard Taft, won the election in 1908, which is actually, when you kind of look at the numbers, like ever since the beginning of the 20th century, the beginning of the 1900s, it's actually not that common for a hand-picked successor to be able to just win that easily. You have to have a really popular president for that to happen.
Yeah. Fucking Clinton was Obama's hand-picked successor, and look how that played out.
Yeah, and like even the successors that kind of won, like LBJ, Truman, they kind of got into the presidency first and then won re-election. So it wasn't even just a matter of like FDR picking Truman or JFK picking LBJ. It was a whole series of things. So you have to be really popular for your hand-picked successor to actually win the election. And Roosevelt was really that popular. So with Taft as president, he actually busted more trusts than Roosevelt did. In one term, he busted over 70 trusts, whereas TR had busted about 40 in his 2 terms.
Just trust busting all day long, baby.
Yeah, he's just really good at busting. He also helped save the post office, and he supported conservation efforts, although not as much as Roosevelt. But kind of those pet issues aside, he really dragged his feet on progressive reform in the country. He just very clearly wasn't as into it as Roosevelt was. And even if he had been, which he wasn't, but even if he had been, he did not possess Roosevelt's charisma or Roosevelt's work ethic. So, because of that, TR, who at first legitimately did not want to run again, was pressured to run. And he really did become, disillusioned with Taft, who he really thought as a friend in the beginning, but he became disillusioned with how little Taft was doing as president from his view. So that's how you get those 2 candidates. Now, Wilson. Woodrow Wilson was a Southerner who grew up during the Civil War and Reconstruction, and he was an educator who became president of Princeton University. Also, super racist.
Like literally racist.
Yeah, sometimes we say, oh, we should not judge people by the present, we should judge them by the standards of their day. Wilson, racist by the standards of his day.
He supported the KKK, showed the birth of a nation. This is some like A-grade racist stuff. Like this is.
Yeah,
Exactly.
even including the presidents that we had that owned slaves, he might actually crack the top 5 most racist presidents we ever had.
Yeah, I think he's arguably the most racist president we had who didn't own slaves, other than maybe a couple other ones, but definitely up there. But if you were a white person, he was great. And it is unfortunate he was so racist because a lot of his other policies when he became governor of New Jersey in 1910 were very cool. He passed laws limiting the power of local and statewide party bosses so that it was more democratically structured. He passed laws limiting child labor, improving factory conditions, giving workers comp, challenging trusts, and strengthening public education. So very, very cool things. But again, it kind of is offset by him being really shitty toward people of color. So that being said, all the progressive policies that he did pass were incredibly popular. And so even though he became governor of New Jersey in 1910, he was such a rising star that he ran for the Democratic nomination for the presidency in 1912.
This is actually a smart thing to do, people, because it's always kind of with Barack Obama. Get your star up, win an office, and before anybody has an ability to make a strong opinion of you, seek a higher office.
Yeah, strike while the iron is hot.
Bad things happen to politicians who, quote unquote, wait their turn. Not to bash on Hillary Clinton too much more, but
yeah, no, I mean, like, I wouldn't even call that bashing because it's kind of just what happened, right? Like, you wait your turn and sometimes the moment just passes you by.
yeah, so you have to strike while the iron is hot.
You got to put that panini in the oven. You know what I'm saying?
I know what you're saying. I hope I know what you're saying. So,
Got to park that car in the garage,
So during the Democratic primary in 1912, Wilson was actually losing to Speaker of the House Champ Clark. Now, the funny thing about this is because Champ Clark was doing well and because he had a lot of kind of connections within the party, he actually got an explicit boost from Tammany Hall in New York, which, Cameron, do you want to explain what Tammany Hall was?
It's some like political chicanery, like bribing people, selling Brooklyn bridges, Boss Tweed.
Yeah,
it's Tammany Hall.
Yeah, it's
like
basically
bribery
the center
stuff.
of like backdoor political ideas, pats on the back, you scratch my back, I scratch yours. Just a lot of very like personal connection mafioso type shit, right?
Yeah.
And so because Tammany Hall then decided to back Champ Clark, William Jennings Bryan, the reformist Democrat who had been the Democratic nominee for something like 4 election cycles or something like that beforehand, he actually put his weight behind Woodrow Wilson because, again, he was a reformer and he really didn't like sort of like backdoor political dealing, corruption that Tammany Hall represented. And so it was that push from William Jennings Bryan that helped bring Woodrow Wilson into the limelight and helped him secure the nomination. Now we have a final candidate for 1912, and that is my boy Eugene Debs. So Eugene Debs was the candidate for the Socialist Party. Debs was originally, though, a railroad worker who came to prominence as a labor leader in a lot of the militant labor strikes of the late 1800s. He was considered saint-like among pretty much everyone who knew him, even his detractors. Even his enemies had to be like, okay, I'm anti-socialist and anti-worker, but damn, he's a nice guy. And so one of the biggest challenges that Debs faced actually was that the Socialist Party had basically two wings. It had a more radical wing, which was associated more with the militant labor organizers and some militant folks kind of scattered around. And then the more kind of moderate wing, which was represented more by academics, skilled blue collar workers. Just as a quick side note, skilled blue collar workers are really kind of all over the place because they could have been progressives during that time. Sometimes they're conservatives, although not usually, but they could be anything from progressives to moderate socialists to straight up like revolutionary socialists. They're just kind of all over the map because on the one hand, they are part of the kind of blue collar working class. On the other hand, they are kind of at the top of the hierarchy of that class. So anyway, yeah, they were a big part within the moderate wing of the Socialist Party. And then also most elected socialist politicians like Congressmember Victor Berger were also part of that moderate wing. What was so special about Debs was instead of choosing a faction, he really tried to emphasize conciliation and compromise between the two. And he was pretty good at it because, again, nice guy, very diplomatic, while also being passionate. So he was able to unite the factions enough to run a coherent campaign. Which brings us to the campaign itself. So for the three major candidates, the way everyone was kind of positioned was Taft was the conservative candidate, Wilson was in the center, and Roosevelt was on the left. Taft's campaign was a pretty lukewarm, charisma-free campaign that called for expanding the judiciary, continuing to keep an eye on the trusts, but otherwise not super exciting, not too much substantive reform ideas. Roosevelt ran on what he called the New Nationalism, which included a federal commission to keep big business under control, really, really drastic tax reform, including a national income tax on the rich, public health care, actually, something that we've been fucking talking about for at least a century, an 8-hour workday, and what would be the idea for Social Security, having that public pension available in old age. Wilson ran on what he called the New Freedom, which was based on tariff reduction, banking regulations, antitrust laws, and other things to limit corporate abuse that were pretty progressive, but not to the extent that Roosevelt's platform was. And so that really is how Wilson defined himself in his campaign. He basically said that we want to kind of do the same things Roosevelt is thinking of doing, but Roosevelt is too collectivist and radical. We're more about individual freedom, but still also balancing that with progressivism. So he really defined himself as the middle path in the election. And just a fun little anecdote, on October 12th, during that campaign, Teddy Roosevelt was shot while giving a speech. He wasn't seriously harmed because his glasses case and a folded copy of the speech, kind of lessened the severity of the impact, but he was still shot. However, instead of leaving, he gave the speech for 90 minutes after being shot. So he kept speaking for 90 minutes after that. It wasn't a total of 90 minutes. He spoke for 90 minutes after he was shot, and then he went to the hospital.
Like he just had to get that done. Like I got to give a speech to the people. I got to win this election.
It's not hyperbole to say that Theodore Roosevelt might have been the toughest person to ever be the president.
Yeah, no, I think that's pretty fair to say. I mean, he even had a brown belt in judo. He boxed. He went hunting. He did a lot of pretty hardcore shit.
Wait,
Legit.
where did he get shot?
He got shot in the chest, but it didn't like pierce a major vein or hit his heart or anything like that.
Yeah, legitimately,
Damn.
one of the few times in U.S. history where like the president could kick your ass.
Yeah.
I thought he got kneecapped, like in Django.
No. But yeah, no, I mean, like, as a martial artist who kind of went through a phase of thinking about which presidents were badass, it's him, Lincoln, who was very tall and a very good wrestler, and I think also Andrew Jackson, not because he knew how to fight, but just because he was a fucking just unhinged violent maniac.
Yeah.
But anyways, that being said, yes, Roosevelt got shot in the chest, kept giving a speech, then went to the hospital, and they decided to just leave the bullet in there, just because taking it out might have potentially caused more harm than just leaving it in there. Because again, didn't pierce anything major. And then during all this time, Debs went around the country appealing to unions, leftist organizations, and working class communities. And, you know, in contrast with the other three who had the entire weight of like the big party apparatuses behind them. I mean, Roosevelt, of course, not as much because he formed the Progressive Party that he was running on, but it had enough connections to progressive Republicans to have some weight behind it. But Debs is just going among the people. He does not have any real meaningful party apparatus behind him. So their platform, the Socialist Party platform, was based on a lot of things, but some of the main ones were collective ownership and democratic management of big industry, extensive public works projects, collective ownership of public lands, a deep social safety net, absolute freedom of speech, absolute freedom of assembly, since a lot of unions and leftist organizers were very violently repressed at the time. And they also had female suffrage and democracy for every U.S. territory under U.S. control. So full democratization, collective ownership were big parts of the socialist platform. Ultimately, in the end, Wilson won by a pretty comfortable margin. He got roughly 42% of the vote. Meanwhile, Roosevelt got about 27%, Taft got about 23%, and Debs got about 6%, which is the best a self-proclaimed socialist has ever done in a general election. Again, you know, Debs got 6% when he didn't have sophisticated party apparatus behind him. He was literally just talking to the people and even facing some competition from Teddy Roosevelt because he was the most leftward mainstream candidate in the same way in the modern that someone might have voted for the leftmost candidate in, say, a Democratic primary instead of voting for a third party. That's kind of what happened to Debs with Teddy Roosevelt.
Quick side note on this. This remains the first and only time that a member of one of the two major parties didn't finish in either first or second place.
Yes, that's right. Yeah, since Teddy Roosevelt got second place, that has not been achieved since. So, a brief epilogue, if you will. Wilson actually ended up governing somewhere between his platform and Teddy Roosevelt's. So he implemented a lot of things that Roosevelt had talked about, including an 8-hour workday and a lot of the sort of like reforms and regulations that Roosevelt had talked about. They weren't quite to what Roosevelt had talked about, but still better. Of course, the glaring exception to this is on the subject of race. Again, Teddy Roosevelt, relative to his time, was more progressive on civil rights than like the average politician of his day. Again, civil rights for folks, for people of color within the US, not Native Americans and not people abroad. But Wilson was just generally super racist, so he undid even the sort of like minor tweaks in favor of civil rights that Roosevelt had implemented. But other than that, he did bring about the high point of the progressive movement overall, or at least until World War I, because World War I was just kind of a disaster for progressivism and also for leftism, both because of the sort of like, you know, the patriotic nationalist fervor that always consumes people during war, also mixed with the fact that in 1917, the Bolshevik Revolution, we talked about in another episode, came to power. And so that combined with the already fervent nationalism of World War I created a sort of Red Scare and really just kind of was not helpful for the left. Roosevelt, for his part, went on a bunch of expeditions after the election that messed with his health. He came back in 1914, and he actually was pretty impressed with Wilson's domestic reforms, but he hated that Wilson tried to remain neutral during World War I. He wanted to go right in there. Dude fucking loved war. So even though he was a little unhappy with the state of the Republican Party in 1916, he did decide to back it. He returned to the Republican Party, And the Progressive Party just could not last without him. So that was essentially the death of the Progressive Party. Taft became a legal professor at Yale after the election until Coolidge put him on the Supreme Court in 1921. And Debs didn't run in 1916, but he kept involved with labor organizing and politics. And he vehemently opposed World War I, which landed him in jail. And actually, in 1920, when he again ran for president on the socialist ticket, he campaigned from jail, which is pretty cool. And he got, I think, like 4% of the vote or something like that, campaigning from jail. And that is the 1912 election.
Fantastic.
Well, so I'm going to speed it up 3 decades. We're going to take a time machine from 1912 to 1944. 1944, big year in world history. It was World War II, and the Allies are getting a foothold of Germany and in the Pacific. And so when war happens, the show has to go on. So we proceed with the election of 1944. The president at this time was Franklin Delano Roosevelt, or good old FDR, as we call him. He's been the president since the early 1930s, and he was running on the New Deal, the structural overhaul of the United States to help people to get to work, help people get jobs, basically help everyone meet their basic security needs. And he was a popular president, so he just kept running train.
He just kept winning.
He just kept winning. All he did was win no matter what. He had money on his mind, and he could never get enough. 1944 was an interesting possibility because this was towards the back end of the war, and I think some people, even his own party and the Republican Party, were wanting to slow down his economic policies because they had seen the United States was winning. We don't need to have all these policies anymore. But he faces a real opposition this time because one, it's back in the war, and two, he's suffering from a lot of health problems, heart failure, cardiac, can't breathe that well, hypertension. Like, he is old as dirt. He is still running on popularity, and rightfully so.
Honestly,
And
it's not
so,
really his age that's bothering him. It's the fact that he's, chronically ill that's probably not making it any better.
and we see it throughout the United States history that, wartime presidents don't generally get replaced. The same could be said for 1944. So his first stern test came from good old Thomas Dewey. And I'm sure you saw that picture with Truman, with the newspaper, Dewey defeats Truman, even though the opposite happened. So Thomas Dewey was the Republican Party nomination. There was a bunch. I mean, even Douglas MacArthur threw his hat in the ring. Thomas Dewey, he was considered internationalist. He supported something the United Nations. He advocated for small government. He said that the Democratic Party is a bunch of motley crew, pro-communist mofos. He got support from Republicans in the East Coast, which is kind of what you need to secure the presidency. And he knocked out Bricker, and he knocked out another Taft.
Taft Jr.
Taft Jr. He knocked off Taft Jr. And so he becomes the Republican nominee. And of course, FDR is the Democratic candidate. But there was also a very interesting backroom stuff that was happening. Not backroom, but there was, I would say, the vice presidential election a bit more interesting than the presidential election itself, because back in the day, vice presidents had to get elected from their own parties. Roosevelt's vice president since 1940 had been Henry Wallace. And Henry Wallace was Secretary of Agriculture at the beginning of FDR's first presidency, and he helped pass the Agricultural Adjustment Act, which helps support small farms instead of big conglomerate farms, to help raise prices and stuff, make sure food gets on the table, make sure farmers are compensated for their work. And after that good work, he becomes vice president of the United States. He was one of the biggest advocates for the New Deal. And honestly, he was pro, let's do relations with the Soviet Union.
So he was like pro-conciliation.
He was pro-conciliation. I think he was kind of like the last progressive politician in the United States. And so we see Bernie Sanders.
Well, I think
someone-
you could make the case for George McGovern and
McGovern as well. But I think in terms of like he was probably the last big progressive politician of the 30s and the 40s. So basically, they thought he would win the vice presidential nomination, but he lost support amongst the moderates and he lost support amongst the conservatives. I just think they wanted him out because he wanted to be pro-Soviet Union, and that was not the flavor of the week. Because
and not even like pro-Soviet Union, but just not wanting to have a stupid dick measuring contest and like rivalry with them.
Not to mention,
yeah,
I think everyone was probably aware of FDR's failing health, and the thought was that whoever the VP was probably going to be in office at some point during this term. Do you really want Wallace to be the guy? I'd say
Yeah.
yes, personally, but
Yeah, absolutely. And also, you know, he was just such an honest guy. Like, he was Mr. Smith Goes to Washington. Like, that was Henry Wallace.
yeah,
he wasn't like what we consider a politician, like a skeevy kind of like person who would compromise his ideals to consolidate power. So the conservatives were able to sway the vote against Henry Wallace, and they elected Harry Truman to be the vice president with Roosevelt. And, he notoriously part of the Prendergast machine, some backroom dealings, and he was staunchly anti-Soviet. So what the Democrats were doing is they were trying to set up America post-World War II. So Roosevelt, he decides to campaign, like really campaign. And so this is after D-Day, and this is after the liberation of Paris. He began his campaigning in October, and most notably, Roosevelt had to fend off a lot of attacks saying how, the Democrats are wasteful with their money. Oh, it's all the big Democratic cities that are making decisions. Where have we heard that before?
When haven't we heard that, right?
Oh, the corrupt Democrats in huge cities about wasting money and needles on the streets. You know what I mean? Like, this is a Republican trope. This is what they use all the time. But
Ever
the
since
thing
the
is,
Republicans became like cemented as the Conservative Party.
yeah, they threw an accusation out that FDR personally like called a destroyer to find his dog in the Aleutian Islands. This is the quote that he said. "These Republican leaders have not been content with attacks on me, nor my wife, nor my sons. No, not content with that. Now they include my little dog, Fala. Well, of course, I don't resent attacks, and my family doesn't resent attacks, but Fala does resent them." So it's basically it's kind of like, it's like, you're pissing off my dog here.
Don't fuck
Like,
with my dog, man.
We don't care why my dog's pissed off now. Like, why are you going after my dog? The biggest thing is that FDR wanted to show that he was still healthy enough to run. Like, everyone knew about his health problems. I think he did it to show, like, look, I'm still up for this job. Like, I'm FDR.
So essentially, like everyone liked Roosevelt. The only real question was, would he be able to properly function basically as president?
Yeah, and he wanted to show America that he was still able to. That speech about his dog galvanized supporters. It shows like other Republicans, look at these jokes. They really don't have a defense. They really don't have an argument against Roosevelt because America's been doing well. They're out of the Great Depression. And this is off the back of D-Day, liberation of Paris. So it's like current administration's always going to get all just the good praise. And so the Republicans go in with losing battle. It looks pretty slim on the popular vote. Like, Thomas Dewey only lost by 3 million, but he loses in an electoral college landslide. So Roosevelt got 432 electoral votes and Dewey got 99.
That is rough.
all of Franklin Roosevelt's elections were huge. Just here, his first one against Hoover, he won 472 to 59.
Damn.
His re-election, he won 523 to 8.
Ooh. Who was his
Which, by the
opponent
way,
in 36?
Alf Landon,
That name we all know, recognize, and love.
which, by the way, is the fourth highest percentage of the Electoral College in history, only matched by the 2 times that Washington won his election unanimously, and the one time that Ron Rowe ran unopposed.
Damn.
And then in
Dang.
1940, he won 449 to 82.
So it was never close.
No, it's Roosevelt put our country in like an economic boom. The New Deal, World War II, it was difficult to, vote against him. Even though, yeah, he did have internment camp stuff. Like, that's a topic for another day. His racial internment camp stuff. We have to judge history on all accounts. And so he wins the presidency. But before that, I'm going to go back to Henry Wallace. Henry Wallace lost the vice presidency, but Roosevelt gave him Secretary of Commerce in his administration. So is he any other cabinet besides Secretary of State?
And it should be said real quick, too, that Henry Wallace was actually one of the main brains behind the New Deal, because a lot of people don't know this, but FDR wasn't really an ideologue. And actually, in the first month or so of his administration, he was relatively conservative. His approach was basically try everything. But it was Henry Wallace and FDR Secretary of Labor Francis Perkins, as well as Eleanor Roosevelt. Those three were kind of the voices in his ear that pushed him in the really progressive direction and basically kind of made the New Deal that, of course, FDR then enacted.
Yeah, and the biggest thing that Wallace contributed to is the Agricultural Adjustment Act.
Yeah, that was his baby.
That was his baby because he got conservative Iowa over to the Democrats, and he helped small farmers instead of big agricultural conglomerates. So he becomes the Secretary of Commerce when Roosevelt is elected, but Roosevelt dies 3 months later as he's inaugurated. He dies in April of 1945. So the war is not yet over. So Truman becomes president. So Wallace is still the Secretary of Commerce under Truman administration, but he ultimately falls out with the Democrats, gets kicked out of his position because he is pro-Soviet. He's pro-relations. And that's not the flavor of the week for the Democrats. So he leaves and he creates the Progressive Party. So he is the spearhead in 1948.
Yeah, the Progressive Party 2.0, basically.
And the Progressive Party 2.0, which advocated for desegregation of public schools, racial and gender equality, and a national health insurance program.
All pretty freaking awesome, I'd say.
All pretty good things.
Oh, I should also say real quick, just, on the topic of FDR's huge freaking blemish being Japanese-American internment, the people I mentioned before, Henry Wallace, Francis Perkins, and Eleanor Roosevelt, were like the main people in his administration being like, what the fuck are you doing? This is fucked up. Don't do this. But of course, they still went through with it. But just a side note on that.
Yeah. The New Dealers told him no, but FDR is like, I'm still doing it. So the Progressive Party get 1 million votes in 1948, but then Henry Wallace splits off for some reason because he sees what's going on in Korea. And I guess he got red baited and he became anti-Soviet, and he wrote a book called Where I Was Wrong. So he kind of just like did that U-turn from progressive idealist. I think he still wanted a part in politics. That's why I think he changed.
Yeah, like during the time when he did that during the 50s, I mean, you could not succeed in politics unless you just performatively hated the Soviet Union and didn't want to have any sort of communication or make any attempt to understand them whatsoever.
Yeah, so I felt Henry Wallace's arc was actually way more interesting than the election itself, because this is like end of New Deal, anti-Soviet stuff. Like, where did he fit in relation to all of this next administration stuff? But we have to go to the biggest significance of the 1944 election. So Roosevelt dies on April 12, 1945, but he had won the presidency 4 times. No one had a problem with it, running as many times as you want before then. But
The Republicans did.
the Republicans, yeah, at that time, the Republicans like, no, we can't do it. It's like we're getting our ass kicked all the time. So Congress sets to write the 22nd Amendment. The 22nd Amendment was term limits. So presidents can only serve 2 terms or 10 years, which is the grandfather clause.
Yeah, so at the time, LBJ was president when this finally, or was it Nixon? One of those
It was LBJ.
at the time. So LBJ could have ran for a third term, and I think he considered it until his popularity tanked due to Vietnam.
Yeah, Truman, he had his years as president, and then obviously ran again. But so the Congress proposed it in March 1947. So the Congress unanimously agreed to it. So now it had to be up for the states. So the amendment didn't get officially ratified until 1951. That was when the final states got the necessary majorities needed. The states that we were waiting on in 51 were Alabama, Florida, Maryland, South Carolina, North Carolina, Minnesota, Nevada, Utah, Texas, Tennessee, Georgia, Arkansas, Wyoming, New Mexico, Idaho, Indiana, and Montana. So these were all the states that voted in 1951. So it took 4 years to get this officially in the Constitution. So this is the election where you cannot run forever. And I find the ironic thing is that Congress sets term limits on the presidency, but they don't set term limits on themselves. So I find that a bit ironic. That they try to curtail the power of the president, but they can just run whenever they want and still be there for life. You know,
Yeah, which hasn't really changed since.
no. And that was the biggest thing, and the significance for me in the 1944 election was the creation of the 22nd Amendment of the United States. We won't see FDRs again.
FDR was so popular and so good and so well liked at his job that they had to create term limits to make sure that shit didn't happen again.
Yup.
Yeah, because they didn't want progressives in office anymore. That's the reason why we don't see a bunch of FDRs anymore. And that's the biggest takeaway from 1944.
That, my friends, is electile dysfunction 2.
Elect
Just
hard.
make sure if you need to watch this for more than 4 hours, contact your doctor. My terrible jokes.
Thank you guys for joining us again. We can't wait to show you more of what we have for season 2. Make sure to like and subscribe us on whatever podcast app you listen to us on. And I guess starting now, make sure to, if you can, support us on Patreon. Become a backer, get some cool stuff, and we can't wait to be able to interact with you guys a little bit more.
Yeah, just
Yeah.
a disclaimer about Patreon, by the way, everyone. Just so you know, we're not putting behind the Patreon wall anything we've done up to this point. None of our episodes are going to be behind the paywall. My weekly Mouthful of David videos are not going to be behind the paywall. So, don't worry about anything like that. Everything that we're bringing with Patreon is stuff we haven't done before. It's all new.
Yeah, we hope, to interact with you guys way more. We got incredible things coming this season. And we look forward to having everybody contribute to what is a mouthful of history.
So, speaking of stuff coming down the line, Nick, what is our next episode going to be about?
Our next episode is going to be about the coup in Iran, the Shah, and what would turn into the revolution, the Islamic Revolution in Iran.
All right. Thank you for listening, everyone. Really appreciate it. Really appreciate those who, have either been longtime fans or are checking us out right now for the first time. We appreciate y'all.
Yep. Thank you for being here with us since day one.
Hopefully, a major celebrity doesn't die in the process of recording this episode like it happened last time.
Yeah, seriously.
Anyway, you guys all have a great day. Stay safe. Wear your mask. Don't end up like Nick with COVID.
Stay safe, everyone.
Stay safe.